Welcome to the Wealth Without Wall Street podcast, your guide to understanding how to get out of the Wall Street rat race and start your own mailbox money lifestyle. Now, don't let these handsome Southern draws fool you. These financial minds are teaching our country to enhance savings, increase cash flow, and create passive income, all without the help of Wall Street. Are you ready to break through? Now here are your hosts, Russ Morgan and Joey Murray.
Joey, it's great to always get to interview somebody as skilled and as smart as Dr. Cleveland.
Way smarter than us, by the way.
And that doesn't take a lot, by the way.
Surround yourself with smart people, smarter than yourself.
That is the best strategy I've ever heard is if you're the smartest one in the room, you need to exit. You need to be around people that are much smarter than you. And today's interview with Dr. Paul Cleveland is pretty cool because he's an economics professor.
At Birmingham Southern, here in Birmingham.
But he travels all over the world to talk. And that's pretty cool is that we keep having some of these experts that are just by chance here in Birmingham that are, called upon to come speak at these conferences all over the place. I feel blessed that we get that benefit.
No doubt at all. And I love the fact that, you're going to hear today just his personal stories, not just this, all these economics terms that may go over your head. He's really unpacking the problems that people are facing that are keeping them from financial freedom, which that's why we're all here, right? We're looking for solutions.
Yeah, speaking of problems, though, Joey, I've got a problem that I'm really trying to fix.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, it's a tough one. How many upsets do I pick in this March Madness bracket? I mean, because right now, today is the day that, we're about to kick off.
Call it kickoff? Because it's basketball?
Well, it's not truly a kickoff, but we're kicking off the March Madness
Tip-off.
Either way works. Okay. I think they would be okay with it. You don't have to show whether or not you know sports or not. We've already alluded to you know nothing about sports.
The Italian Stallion does not know much about sports.
By the way, when you were picking your bracket for our office client pool, did you use the names of the teams or did you use the mascots?
I went with the eeny meeny approach. Okay, eeny meeny.
Because this morning I was doing the brackets with my son, my 5-year-old Ryan, and I wanted to help him. And typically with children, I've figured this out in the past. If I use the name system, they'll just pick the second name I say, which usually is the lower seed. So if I feel like I'm doing an injustice to them, it's like, do you want Virginia or do you want UMBC? UMBC. And I'm like, okay. By the way, I love UMBC. I lived in Baltimore. I had a friend of mine who was an assistant coach for the Retrievers back in the day, but I was like, buddy, I don't believe the 16 seed's going to pull this one out. So what I started doing is I used the mascot. So, do you want the Retrievers or do you want the Cavaliers?
And so what's a Cavalier?
But, being an Auburn guy and the fact that this kid loves Tigers, and there's a lot of Tigers in this bracket.
Yeah.
I just want to let you know we've got an all Tigers Final Four.
Heavy on the Tigers.
We're heavy on the Tigers.
I got you.
So that's a problem, but it's great that we're going to sit down with Paul today and we're going to have him kind of help us uncover some of the problem that's facing us as we're trying to reach financial freedom. And I think it's going to be unique to hear some of his answers because his background goes way back into this infinite banking concept. I mean, he knew Nelson Nash back in the 90s.
One of the older clients of this whole idea.
Yeah, he's been implementing this process as long as, most people that we would know.
Over
for certain
20 years, yeah.
And also just his background in academics and the books that he's written on socialism and overcoming the thought process of that and how economics plays into these things. So I'm interested to see some of his responses and just pick his brain because he's definitely one of the smarter people we've had on the show. Well, welcome in, Paul. It's so great to have you here today. I love the slogan that you have, which is navigating a confusing world. And when we get out there and we start reading information, whether it be economics or history, which are really two and the same, aren't they? There's a lot of confusing information and in your eyes, probably misinformation. Would you agree?
I would absolutely agree with that, Russ. And it started a long time ago with the public school movement. and the consolidation of education in government hands.
Yeah. I mean, well, I can tell you, I'm a product of that education. Growing up in Montgomery, if you could hear any of the stories that I have, and I've shared many on this podcast, there's a lot of information that I was learning or presumed to be learning in the public school arena that just I've discerned that wasn't quite accurate. I mean, hence the name of the high school, Paul, that I went to was Robert E. Lee.
Right.
Do you know it took me until after college and probably not maybe 10, 15 years ago where I really learned the background of Robert E. Lee and what sort of a man he was and who he really was versus what I had learned in history books and other things. So I totally agree, but that's not why we're here. We're here to talk a little bit about what is someone looking for. And as we sit on this podcast, the people that you're talking to today are looking for ways to make work optional. They really are seeking financial freedom, and they're wanting to do it outside of the purview of Wall Street. And I just feel like there's some things holding them back. And I've listened to you many times. So from your eyes, what are some of the biggest challenges facing somebody from achieving those goals?
Well, first thing I would say is this, that there was a song back, I guess it was in the 80s, and it went something like this: you're looking for love in all the wrong places.
Are you going me to sing it for you guys if you hadn't heard that?
Anyway,
Please don't.
I would say in this case, most people are looking for security in all the wrong places. And quite frankly, I think they've been taught to do so. Just a real brief example of this, and it just astounded me. After the financial crisis in 2008 and the government's bailout of Wall Street banks, you had these young people go out and camp out in the park with the Occupy Wall Street. On the one hand, I could really sympathize with their plight. I mean, I understood being angry at why are we bailing out these big bankers?
Yeah, these guys are making all the money. We're sitting out here poor. I mean, we're camping out for goodness sake.
They should have failed, but they were advocating for more government, for socialism. And I'm like, why would you do this? This makes no sense whatsoever. The very triad of the corporatist bankers with government officials, with a rogue Federal Reserve, created the crisis to begin with. Why would you want to give more power to the government?
Try to get the people who created the problem to create a solution
a solution to the problem. And so it really made no sense. And it just pointed to me that people are so miseducated over the reasons for the real problems that they face. And, that's a hard thing to overcome sometimes.
So for anybody, in this room, I feel like we've been educated on some of these issues that you're saying that the problems have been created,
but not initially. It took a lot of
recently.
Took a lot of unlearning, right?
Yeah,
At least on my end.
About growing up. So for those that maybe haven't, give us a couple of points that here's where a problem was originated.
Okay, for example, in the banking area, in money and banking. Now there were always some issues. We never had free enterprise in banking in America's history. There was state government involvement, and then there were forays into fractional reserve banking where people created paper notes way beyond precious metals to back those notes up. See, it used to be that $1 was 1 ounce of silver.
Right.
That's what $1 was. And you could go in, you could take your paper dollar down to a bank and you could trade it in for a 1 ounce silver coin, the silver dollar. But what happened in 1913 is the federal government, in essence, monopolized money and banking. And they did it in kind of a shrewd way because when they created the Federal Reserve, they created it as this private institution, in quote, that would be the banker's bank, as it were, and control the money supply. But in truth, it was a monopolization of banking, and it put the federal government in control because it gave the power of the government to pick the chairman of the board.
And this was all kind of done kind of in like a coup style where it was done when most people had gone home for the holidays, right?
Sure.
A lot of these, that law was passed.
It goes back to the Wilson administration. Woodrow Wilson, let me be blunt about it. I've always tried to be blunt. Wilson was our first full-fledged socialist president.
Mm-hmm.
Now, they didn't call themselves this. He called himself a progressive because, I mean, after all, who could be against progress?
Right.
Words matter.
You know, words do matter.
Marketing, for
Makes
certain.
sense.
We've
Right.
talked about that with the Wall Street mindset.
And so he moved quickly to adopt policies that were straight out of Marx's playbook, instituting a progressive income tax with the 16th Amendment, trying to
A temporary,
a temporary,
right?
yeah, it was
Okay.
temporary.
7% tax, only if you would qualify for it.
Yeah, in other words, you only
Only the
pay,
rich.
you only paid that 7% if you made in what would be today's dollars over $9 million in taxable income. For most people, they would have been exempt totally from the tax according to the original schedule. So it gave us that, consolidated power and control in Washington by cutting state governments out of having any say in Washington with the 17th Amendment, because that changed the way senators were selected. Used to be that state houses picked their senators, which made state governments have some say in what kind of laws would get passed. And then, of course, the Federal Reserve was created. I refer to the Fed as our counterfeiter du jour, and they've been doing a good job of it.
They've been printing money the old-fashioned way, right?
Yeah. Actually, you know, Russ, I don't even have to print it anymore. It's an electronic entry.
I mean, who wants to work and go through all the labor of paying electrical bills and having to put ink in machines? Let's just let's just put dots on computer
Not
screens
good
now.
for the environment, all that paper.
It's part of the environmental movement at this point, right?
Well,
Don't get us started on that, right?
It's the green way.
I asked my students how many of them wish they had the power to add some zeros behind their first number and their checking account balance, and many of them say that would be a great thing.
They were in for that.
They're in for it.
So, by the way, you'll appreciate this. When I'm driving down the road, I'm doing my best to teach my children about economics, and I can remember sitting there talking to one of my daughters about how inflation works, right? You know,
Right.
and it's, you know, trying to teach her as it relates to the goods and things that she's purchasing and helping her understand it's really this inflation of the money supply. You know, once I've explained it to her into a way that she realized it was stealing money out of her pocket by this money being printed, in a very simple analogy I was giving her, she said, "Well, isn't that illegal?" I said, "It's illegal if you and I do it." She goes, "Well, why isn't it illegal for our government to do it?" And this was at like 8 years old. She gave me this response, and I said, "You now know more than 90% of Americans, because they don't even think about it in light of that."
Yeah, that's a great question your daughter asked. It. You know, why is an action that's done by the federal government that would be totally immoral and illegitimate for us to do? Why is it right for them to do the same thing? I think that's a serious issue, and really is where a lot of the problems we face come from. No one's really asking that question.
So would you say that the problem facing people from achieving financial freedom and making work optional is theft?
Yes, I would. And theft perpetrated by our own government, unfortunately.
And theft comes in many different forms, not just in inflation in your eyes.
Sure it does. Inflation is just an easy way for our government to tax you without ever having to pass any legislation to do so. But it taxes you in many other ways as well, by driving prices of goods and services that you purchase up through policies like, well, for example, Donald Trump's new tariff on aluminum and steel.
Okay, you're going to have to explain that because this is a hot topic. But
yeah, the protectionism concept is lost on some people.
Well, let's kind of walk through it a little bit, and I think you'll see this. This is a special interest. I mean, not everyone works in producing, aluminum and steel. That's a fairly specialized business. Now, you may have family and friends that are in that business, and you might go, well, that'll be good for them. Well, yeah, you would be right. It'd be good for them. But driving the price of aluminum and steel up means that everything that's made from aluminum and steel is now going to be more expensive to make in the U.S.
Mm.
And I was talking with someone at church the other day about this, and he gave me the example from the George Bush increase in the steel tariff days, that he had a client that was producing propane tanks, and it put them out of business because steel became so expensive to him that they couldn't compete on price with foreign makers of propane tanks.
Oh, wow.
Well, and it is, so then those are dollars that those jobs are lost in his area.
Right.
The dollars that we're having to pay for a more expensive product that is out there is dollars that we can't use to buy
do.
other things and
Exactly.
investments and other things.
So many things end up not happening that would have happened if that policy weren't put in place.
But wait a minute. Isn't this to protect American jobs? I mean, isn't that why we would put these tariffs in place?
Yeah, but on net, you'll actually lose more jobs than you'll protect.
Well, whenever
So the government is telling us one thing, but another thing is happening simultaneously.
That's correct.
Well, and I think that's important. I mean, the topic that we have today is really around understanding what's the problem that exists and how that affects us. And maybe it's just in communication to our own family and teaching. And I know that's your background as a professor of economics and have written many, many books, and you've got lectures online for all sort of different curriculums. It goes into just understanding the problem so that way you can adequately communicate it. And then not to mention when you're down and you're voting on different laws, you understand what you're voting for. Guys, I think so often people get on this kind of, and we talked about this on a previous episode, this binary option that if I resonate only with Republicans, then I have to vote straight line. I have to go everything. So if it came out of Donald Trump's mouth, I have to do it. Or I'm on the other side. I'm on the liberal agenda. I have to vote everything that they say, even though I don't agree with killing babies or whatever the agreement is, versus being able to look from a logical, objective point of view. And I think in order to do that, you have to really understand what's going on behind the scenes.
Exactly. And I think a lot of people are trying to look for a political solution to their problems. I don't think that one really exists. The solutions to most of your problems, I think you're more likely to find that are privately driven in private contracts with like-minded people. And so trying to get the right law passed or the right person elected to office or that sort of thing is not going to be, I think that's not going to be a successful strategy for the individual in the long run.
Okay, so you have to explain that a little bit further because I'm pretty much sure I know what you're talking about, but I want to make sure it's very clear. Like you've learned all these things over the years.
Right.
And then looking at the problem, you've had to come up with your own solution, even personally.
Sure.
And so you're saying doing it through private means versus some sort of political solution.
Yes. As I began to study economics more seriously and solve my own miseducation about the subject through study after getting my PhD.
So you're saying there is reasons to keep reading books after you leave college?
There's absolutely reasons to continue to read books. And by the way, if you want some good books on the subjects, I've got a few. So
and we'll point those out. Those will be in the show notes.
Yeah, don't miss that on the show notes.
But you have to continue to read. And Leonard Read, who founded the Foundation for Economic Education, had a statement. I thought, well, that's quite right. Anything that's peaceful. Now think about that. If people live together peacefully and pursue voluntary, mutually agreeable transactions with one another, then that's going to promote your greater well-being in time. And so if you focus on those sorts of things and then try to insulate yourself against some of the worst things that our own government is doing to hinder your progress, then you're more likely to get there yourself. Now, I was greatly aided in this when a great admirer and friend of Leonard Read read an article I wrote that was published in Fee's little publication called The Freeman. And he called me up and we talked for a while and he said, we must have lunch together. So this individual's name was Nelson Nash. And Nelson and I became friends over the course of the next couple of years. And Nelson, one of his business was he was in the life insurance business. And he began to share with me a personal financial strategy that you could begin to try to insulate yourself against some of the headwinds of government.
How long ago was this, Paul?
My article was published in November of 1991.
Okay.
If you know anything about Mr. Nash, you would know that he is a voracious reader. And he would get his copy of the Freeman every month, read it cover to cover. So he was calling me within minutes of finishing my particular, because we happened to live in the same city. I think it was by 1994, he convinced me that his strategy was a very good one. I'd been trying to pursue the world's way of saving for the future. I knew that, you had to save.
Right.
If you want to get somewhere,
You got to put money away.
You got to put money away. But I was finding myself not being able to make much progress because I'd put some money away, but then I'd have to pay tax on the interest. And
So you weren't in the Progressive Party, is what you're saying?
no, I was not. And but the Progressive Party was hindering me.
It was at work.
They were progressing based upon your efforts.
And they were providing some pretty heavy headwinds.
That's right.
And so I felt like I was swimming against the tide.
Yeah.
And so, I'm trying to do some things, but I'm not making much progress. But when Nelson explained his plan, I began to implement it. And it was, it was hard at first. And it's certainly not a just go out and get rich quick.
Right.
But it's a plan that over time will improve your personal financial circumstances if you just work it with discipline and prudence.
And what you're talking about is just using specially designed insurance contracts as your basis for where you store cash before you go and invest it in things that you know.
Exactly.
And our listeners are very familiar with that. They've heard us talk about that lots of times. The one thing that I don't know if we've gone into detail, which I think this is a great time as you keep talking about the headwind and the adversity that we're facing. The Wall Street mindset is constantly telling people to try to make a higher return on your investment. Right. They're getting you to focus on that. And in Nelson Nash's book, the one Becoming Your Own Banker, we've mentioned on here plenty of times, he has a great analogy of flying an airplane. Here we sit in Birmingham, Alabama. He said, if you were going to fly an airplane, let's just assume it could go 100 miles an hour, and you are flying to Chicago. You can't fly that airplane in a vacuum. It has to go through an environment, right? And what we're talking about in the environment is what's going on in the market, what's happening with government taxation, inflation, and other factors. And he says to us, let's assume you have debt, for instance.
Right.
And he broke down that 34.5 cents of every dollar the average American brings home is being paid out in interest to service the debt. He calls that the headwind, exactly what you're talking about. And he says the person on the street, though, will sit at the water cooler talking with their friends about how their airplane is going 110 miles an hour.
Right.
Yet they'll never address the headwind that's forcing them backwards.
Exactly.
And the headwind, whether it's taxation, the headwind, whether it's lack of education and information that exists out there, I think is a great analogy for people to understand that it just can't be about trying to make your airplane go faster.
Exactly. That's very much the case. And I mean, think of it this for a moment. I mentioned earlier that there was a time you could go down to a bank and take your paper dollar and exchange it out for a silver dollar. Well, there was that Taco Bell commercial not many years ago where a granddad was going to give his son his prized silver dollar as a memento. And then he saw the dollar menu at Taco Bell.
Oh my goodness! If he ate that, he just died immediately.
And he said, never mind. I'm going over here. Well, that we all laugh because no one who possesses a silver dollar is taking that down to the Taco Bell. In fact, even if you're gonna go to Taco Bell, which may not be a good choice, but if you're going to go
ahead and call that right there.
You're gonna pay with paper.
Yes.
that silver dollar is going to remain in a safe somewhere.
Right.
And for good reason, because it's worth a heck of a lot more than $1. So this is what's happening out there. You're not going to be able to change that. That's what the Federal Reserve, that's what the federal government, that's what others are doing. And your ability to change that, it's non-existent.
Right.
The taxes that you pay as well, if it's taxable, you can't change that. Well, so if I'm trying to save money in a taxable investment, I'm being blown backwards.
Well, just to your points, I just looked it up. The spot price today on an ounce of silver is a little over $16. So what that tells you, Joey, is that our dollar, since they took it off that standard and they just started printing money, has lost 94% of its value. 94% of its value since they started printing money. So when I was talking about the example with my daughter of how they're stealing money from you, the dollars you have no longer are dollars. They're worth 6 cents in relationship to what they used to be.
It's credit. It's mainly just credit. And they manipulate it really at will. And so whatever your strategy is, you got to account for these things.
Right.
And so this is why Nelson's strategy is so good, because in this strategy, you can begin to build wealth that's tax-free.
I mean, from your background, you've started saving money into these insurance contracts back into the mid-90s. Just a few things that you've done with the money.
Well, I'm not sure I can remember them all. I'll tell you the very first one that I did is that we were in our house. We've only had 2 houses since we've been in Birmingham. And in the first one, we had a AC heating unit go out. So we had to replace that. And I guess I was about 3 years in on the policy that Nelson got me to purchase. And I'm thinking about, well, how am I going to pay for this heating and air conditioning unit? So I'd called Nelson up. I told him how much it would be. And I said, do I have enough cash value to borrow that money from the insurance and pay? He goes, oh, yeah, I'll call him today. So he did. And I got a check within the week. I ended up signing a contract with a company to come install the unit that I picked. And they said, they came in with their financing options. And Mr. Cleveland, how do you want to pay for this? And I said, well, you take MasterCard. At the time, I had one of those Shell MasterCards where you get gas.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, I can use a few dollars worth of gas on the deal.
Yeah.
And they go, well, we'll offer you a better interest rate. And I said, well, I really don't care. I'm not paying interest to the MasterCard either. So it doesn't really matter to me. All of a sudden, they put the unit in and we were good. I do teach finance, so I know how to do an amortization table. And I began to pay my loan back according to the way Nelson taught me to do it. And every month I wrote the check out and was paying that off. Well, I was in the position at the time where my game plan on automobiles was you buy one, you try to pay as much in cash as you can. You have to take out a loan for the rest, try to pay off as quickly as possible. And then whatever automobiles you have, you drive it until the wheels fall off.
Right.
So I owed a little on my good car.
You mean your wife's car?
Not my wife's. Exactly.
That's the way that works in my household, at least.
It's the way it works in our household, too. So I was looking at it and I go, wait a second. I could borrow that money back out or against it, pay off that loan, and write whatever the check I was writing to the bank, plus what I'd already gotten used to pay off the loan. And so I did that. Ever since then, this thing's just started to snowball.
There's some great examples of paying for expenses and things that we have on a daily basis. Have you used it to invest in anything that you know, for instance?
Well, this is how I launched my business, Boundary Stone.
Yeah.
Every business has to be financed. When I've launched an educational services business, to provide for me to have the capital equipment I need to do my work, laptops, cell phones, all this sort of stuff, plus publish my books. I had the resources to do that. I had the financing. So I was able to borrow from the insurance companies, print my books, and have the business pay the
Uh,
loans off at
yeah.
interest.
As revenue came in, you just took the money and you paid it back.
Exactly.
And that's the model that we've shared many times on here, whether we're taking the money or investing into real estate or into businesses or lending it out, as Joey's given some examples in the past. It's just become a great tool for us. So it's pretty neat to see you as an economics professor who started doing this in the 90s.
Yeah.
You have a lot more history. I mean,
Right.
I started this in 2009. So my history is relatively new. We're still 9 years in of doing this, but to hear your story much, 15 years longer than mine, that's pretty cool. Well, give us, if you would, just what you think would be a process that one of our listeners should take. If they want to get freedom, they've got this government headwind just slapping them down as fast as they possibly can. What would be just a couple of simple steps you would tell somebody to take to help them get there?
Okay. I think first, you really have to correct that miseducation. You really need some knowledge about what's really going on out there, because I think so many people they'll watch the news and they'll get sidetracked. And so that's number one. And that's something I do. If you want to take a first step, I do a weekly, 5-minute teaching video on various topics that you can plug into.
And those are awesome. By the way, go to boundarystone.org. Right there on the page, you can see his bookstore. But if you scroll to the bottom, you can sign up to be a part of the email list, which that gives you access to those weekly videos, which, by the way, I love. And I share those with my kids. They're great learning, teaching tools.
And I would say the second thing to do is you need your own personal financial plan. If you've not thought about the infinite banking system as a process, you need to investigate that. Try to learn how that works. And I think as you begin to explore it and learn how that works, you'll become convinced, like I was, that it allows you to overcome a lot of those headwinds that you're going to face, whether you like that or not.
And I'm going to sidetrack this just 1 second, though, because in your world, being in economics, not everybody thinks the way the Austrians think, and that's your area of expertise. And you're in different conferences and you're sharing things. Surely at some point you've had to tell one of your economic fellows out there about this concept of what you're doing. Sure. And I got to imagine you got some headwind coming at you.
Absolutely.
You had some Wall Street mindset coming at you. That
you do, because just because you're an economist and maybe your economics is spot on doesn't mean you've thought this one through. Right. I mean, I had not thought this through, although by the time I met Nelson, I was a pretty devout Austrian economist at that point, just because of what I was reading. It took Nelson a while to teach me, because I knew nothing about life insurance, nothing, even though I was teaching finance at the time. So, it's that problem of not coming to grips with what you really don't know. A lot of times you can think, okay, I know what I should do here, when no, you may not know. And so exploring the ideas is certainly the place to begin.
Well, now I want to jump in and this has kind of become clear as we've done this interview. We really hammer on education, right? Educating our kids. We've talked about recently with our interview with Connor Boyack. So his series, the Tuttle Twins books, really are aimed at that 5 to 10-year-old kind of dynamic. But then beyond that, now you're offering high school courses.
Yeah, we're targeting high school children. If you care about your kids living in a world that's advancing, you need to make sure that they're not being taught the socialism that most young people today are marching in the streets clamoring for.
Right.
Because that will be a disaster for them and for your grandchildren and who knows who else.
Well, and that's the first way in, right? Is through the education system.
It's through the education system.
So people can download those or order that on your website?
You can order all that on our website.
So we'll put a link in the show notes so that you can have access to that. And then, of course,
for adults too,
need education.
Any of us, because I had to go back and be challenged by a number of mentors in my own life after getting a PhD to question what many of the things I'd been taught.
So we definitely want to highlight your books on the bookstore. The Great Utopian Delusion is one that I've personally read and gotten a ton out of. So we'll make sure that that's very clear in the show notes. But Another thing that we want to just offer as a result of what you're saying today is to offer a webinar. We want you to go on our show notes. You have a ability to sign up for a webinar on how to build wealth without Wall Street, a simple solution to break free, where we're going to uncover, just like you said, the IBC process, infinite banking process.
And how it breaks free of these problems that you've laid out. The taxation that's facing us, the Wall Street mindset that's preventing us from getting there, the theft,
the manipulation
of all these things. We're going to take, and these are some of the problems you shared with us in different, not only on this episode of the podcast, but other things that we've done, and take that. And then, like you said, just show how that infinite banking concept plays out. Because not everybody who's listening, Paul, has implementing this. A lot of them have, but we want to be able to break that out very simply. So we're going to have a webinar that you can sign up for that's going to tell you exactly how this works. Not necessarily for you, because that's going to require some individualism.
Right.
But we're going to show how it works in context of certain scenarios.
Very good. I mean, that's what people need.
So obviously we have a lot of homework from this episode, but I think it'll be great. I just want to thank you, Paul, for being with us today, uncovering some of these things that maybe people have always experienced but never knew how to put their thumb on. And so very grateful for your insight today and being with us.
Well, thanks for having me.
Russ, I think we're a little bit spoiled to have Dr. Paul Cleveland in here dropping these great bombs of knowledge on us. But how many people that came and listened to this for the first time were feeling this extreme weight? Like, what is keeping me from building wealth?
Yeah, as I sat there and listened to that, I thought, I really wish I had a Paul Cleveland as my econ professor in college. Because I got to be honest with you, Joey.
No doubt.
I didn't learn any of the things that he's been teaching. And I've read a couple of his books. I love the great Utopian Delusion. And I've listened to him many times talk about the basics on economics. I just think that those are the things that will help us. And I love the fact that it's also a way that we can start teaching our children as they grow into high school.
Those resources are invaluable.
And just sharing those books with our audience. So please go to our website. We're definitely going to be giving you the links so that you can not only sign up to get his weekly 5-minute video, but also you can get a link to read some of those books for yourself and maybe for your adult children as well.
Yeah, to show notes, this is episode 27 you just listened to. And we're going to have also a way for you to sign up for the webinar. Yep. How to break free, simply put.
Now, this is the first time we've done this, and now episode 27, the first time we've actually given somebody an opportunity to go see exactly what the solution to the problem that Dr. Cleveland so clearly spelled out for them. So if you haven't had a chance to listen to something, meet with us personally or on a webinar, you need to get onto this webinar, sign up, and it's going to give you really a clear vision to how you can overcome the theft that he was pointing out to us.
No doubt, no doubt. And speaking of theft, it's leading us right into next week's episode, right?
Well, you've got a great story on next week as we talk about why you cashed out your IRA and haven't looked back.
How many questions do I get about this on a weekly basis, right? Once people understand the problem that their money is locked up and it's penalized and all these things, they always say, could I get money out of my IRA?
Should I do that? Is that okay to do that? I mean, that seems like that's going way against the grain.
Exactly. And I'm happy to share my experience. It's only my experience. Take it with a grain of salt, but that's what's coming next week. Here, listen in as we share a little bit from next week's episode. I'm realizing, well, why in the world do I keep putting money in my 401k, which again, eventually lend itself to being an IRA when I left the company I was with. But it was all these limits, right? There's limits on how much I can put into it each year. There's limits on...
Well, don't you want to have a limit of how much money you can put into something, Joey?
If it's good for me, why would I want a limit?
If it's good for you, you shouldn't do it that way. I mean, now I will say, food, I love eating. I should put limits on how much birthday cake I ate last week and had another piece today, by the way.
Yes, he did.
We saw that.
Yeah. There should be limits to those kind of things. There should be limits to how much alcohol I would consume or limits to how much episodes of The Office I watch in a given week. All of these things I have, gone over from time to time, but when it comes to saving money, why should I have limits on it?
This has been the Wealth Without Wall Street podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to the show to break free of the Wall Street mindset and begin building wealth on your own terms in places you understand so that your wealth will never run dry. See you next episode.